or criminal contact. Even in one situation, a gentleman who was married to a lawful permanent resident and had an infant and had ICE. He literally graduated a month earlier. He hadn't left on a student visa yet because he wanted to try to finish up on some classwork, and ICE came, picked him up, and arrested him and put him into immigration detention. So that definitely has been happening. Another thing that's been happening is people being picked up with pending charges. A lot of people all throughout the state of Minnesota, they may or may not even make it to their arraignment hearing. Shella could talk a little bit more about that. But even before they get assigned a public defender, ICE can come in and sort of take them into immigration detention. And that causes all sorts of problems because they may or may not be able to get their case resolved. They may not even know who to contact to talk about getting their case resolved. And so that's something that we're seeing quite a bit. Logistically, there's a lot more detention centers being used in the state of Minnesota. Obviously, Hennepin County is not a nice detention facility. It does not exist in Hennepin. Ramsey, which was formerly used, is no longer used at all. So really, the only detention facilities are out of the metro area. They include Sherburne County, Freeborn County, and Carver County. Those have been three standbys since the mid-2000s, have been in use for quite some time. Sherburne especially being used not just for immigration, but for federal detainees as well as for Department of Corrections. Two new facilities have started to hold a lot more people, one in Candy, Ojai, in Wilmer, and one in Nobles County as well. So those have been some of the larger changes. Obviously, I'm sure you've heard quite a bit about the change in public charge. My colleague Steve Miley did a whole session on that at the law school. There's a lot that's going on. I'm sure you've read quite a bit. We don't have the final rules, so a lot of what we're talking about on the proposed rules are just proposals. We had, I believe, the largest number of comments ever on a proposed regulation change. It's unclear whether that will make any difference and whether that's going to go forward or not. We are just very recently, we're seeing more people who were detained at the border being transported up here to detention facilities up here. We just got a report of about 15 people from the border being housed now at Freeborn County Jail. And I'm also happy to talk a little bit about what I know about the Hennepin County funding and how that's going on that representation. If you have questions, we are partners with a group of organizations that are doing that representation. We ourselves are not directly involved, but we are partners and we're working with them on several different. So I'm happy to talk about that as well. Okay, thanks.
And Moyan,
Sure. All right. Is my slide? There it is. So I'm Moyan Syed, faculty in the Department of Psychology at the University of Minnesota. Importantly, I am a research psychologist, not a clinical psychologist, so I don't see and treat patients. This is what happens when you ask a research psychologist or a researcher to provide one slide of information. I think as much possible on it as possible. It's not as complicated as it actually looks. So I'm a little bit different in that I don't really know much about laws or policies or things of that nature. I know a little bit about that. What I bring, though, is more of an understanding of sort of the subjective, experiential aspects of immigration in terms of how youth in particular, so broadly our young adolescents through emerging adults to adults, sort of how they feel psychologically about their cultural identity and what the implications are for their psychological well-being. And in terms of the way, sort of the general way of thinking about how immigrants should psychologically adapt to a new culture, there's a general belief, especially in the US, that the more that immigrants become US, more American, the less they should be identified with their culture of origin. So to assimilate, that you become like everyone else in your environment and you shed ties with your culture of origin. And that's been long held folk belief of sort of the way to become American is to just forget about the past, speak English, forget your other languages, and do as everyone else does. And so what we know now from decades of research, I should say as a research psychologist, when I'm talking about what we know or what we think we know, it's really based on accumulated evidence and based on data. So it's not based on my own belief or speculation, and it's not based on me seeing clients or patients in a therapeutic context, but based on quite a bit of large-scale evidence and data. So we know this idea that you have to choose one or the other, be American or be Mexican, is quite false. That in fact it's possible to be both simultaneously. Okay, so that's what we see here on this side is rather than seeing sort of identification with the host culture, so the U.S., and identifying with the heritage culture, so Mexican culture, as being in conflict with one another, we actually can understand them as being complementary and independent dimensions. Right? So you can think of how the two interact with one another. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this, but the two at the top are sort of the most critical components. One is that if an individual sort of identifies heavily with the host culture, so identifies very much as American, but does not identify as being Mexican, we can say that person is sort of assimilated. They've assimilated to the local culture and don't have ties to their past. Right? In contrast, if they identify with both, we can say that they're bicultural or integrated, that they have a dual cultural identity. And the accumulated evidence is quite clear on this point, that those who identify as bicultural are doing much better psychologically than those who identify as assimilated or marginalized or separated. So the most optimal way to configure your multiple cultural identifications is to in fact embrace those multiple cultural identifications and try to figure out how they might fit together, which is not always an easy task, right? We can talk a little bit about that. So that's at the individual level, the self level, but we can also understand these dynamics at the societal level, in that the broader culture, the broader society may sort of have a preference or structures that expect one type of cultural identification over the other. Right? So the environment might promote, expect, anticipate a certain way that we create our identities. Right? So I already alluded to that before when talking about what sort of generally people believe immigrants should do or how they should identify. That in the U.S. broadly, if we take the U.S. culture broadly, there's a culture of assimilation. Right? That's the expectation, not a culture of promoting biculturalism. And those of you who were at my presentation, I see some familiar faces. Thanks for coming again. We talked about how in some other cultures, like in Canada and Sweden in particular, there's more of an emphasis on promoting biculturalism over assimilation. So this is sort of a cultural choice that we as a society decide what to value, right? So you have how individuals configure their identities, how society anticipates or expects or promotes or constrains those identities. And so these two might go together or might not. Right? So in the US context, we know that a bicultural identity is optimal, but that the broader society really promotes an assimilated identity. So you have a conflict between the self and how individuals are developing optimal selves and what the broader context is supporting. So that's all I'll say for now. Happy to talk more about this. That's a general overview of what I talked about, so you don't have to watch the hour-long presentation. Thanks.
Very good, though.
Yeah.
Joe, do you want to?
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm honored to be part of this panel. I am not an academic, I'm a lawyer. I'm a public defender, so what that means is that my office represents indigent or people who are accused of crimes. Those people can be adults or children, and it's our job to represent them in court. We strive to educate them, advise them, empower them, and we fight for them in court. We also represent kids who are in the child protection system. In 2010, the United States Supreme Court, the highest court of this land, decided that it was our obligation as criminal defense attorneys to not only inform our clients of what the potential consequences could be, but also to specifically advise how immigration status could be impacted by a conviction. So my office responded, and we responded with having a plan to have an immigration team. Initially, my office had an in-house immigration lawyer who was embedded in our office, who helped provide our staff with the individual advice for each and every client. And as you might imagine, funds become more limited, and that one position is one position that is not filled by a criminal practitioner. So we had to retool, as well as Linus took away our one lawyer. We have a wonderful partnership and we're excited that she was there. But we then had to retool and think about our processes. So when I was appointed to be a managing attorney of immigration, I had to come up with a plan and come up with a plan quickly. What we decided to do is to expand our team. Our team now includes support staff. That's helpful because when Kathy was doing it, she did it all herself. It was super hard to serve all of our clients. To date, today, when I looked at our stats, we have served non-citizen clients to date 900. We don't double count. So if someone comes in with multiple cases where we need to provide tailored advice, I count that only once. And so 900 clients to date. We also added a paralegal, a bilingual, bicultural paralegal. Spanish is the primary language that many of our clients speak. And so we have that paralegal who's trained also and sensitive to immigrant issues to do intakes with our clients, to walk them through the process of what brought them here, what's wanting to keep them here, and what their concerns are if they are to be removed or sent back to their home country. We also consult. We have a contract with an immigration specialist, a lawyer who focuses primarily on immigration, and her name is Sheila Stolman. And Sheila is then able to analyze all the information that we obtain from our clients and provide that tailored advice for each and every client on each and every case, for each and every charge. It's a difficult process, but I do think that our office has gotten really good at trying to get in and build that trust with our clients. It's been difficult. As Professor Chan indicated, many of our clients meet us in 3, 5, if we have a lot of time, 7 minutes on an arraignment calendar. And we are trying to assess whether or not there are other issues that we need to address right now, because if they leave this courtroom, it is possible they could be arrested and detained by ICE. It's hard. People are scared. And it's really difficult for them to also parse out who's friend and who's foe with the government. But we're getting better. And so I find it a privilege to serve our clients, citizen and non-citizen, and I take it very seriously that it's our obligation to inform them of what might happen to their status. We're doing a better job of partnering with our community supports. So when we are able to identify a non-citizen client having potential relief, or maybe even not having relief, but needing assistance if they are detained in ICE custody, we try to connect them with an immigration practitioner. We're criminal defense attorneys. We're not immigration lawyers. And immigration law is extremely complex, but we want to inform our clients so that they can be prepared for that next hearing if they have that. Thank you.
Thank you. And then we had one other panelist that couldn't make it. I mentioned Professor Ryan Allen from the Humphrey School. And you can see again the diverse ways that we approach this from a lot of different angles, because Professor Ryan Allen, he looked at deed information and census information. Some of you were there and saw that. And he basically kind of made the case as to what Minnesota needs to do in order to maintain economic viability in the future and how that relates to immigration. And so just a couple of his slides I'm going to pop up. Just, it's clear that historically he had a little information that showed that, like, Minnesota led immigration in the 19th century in our country. So obviously we're not there now, but it's not a completely foreign concept to have a lot of immigration in order to make our economy work. And then he also kind of pointed out, if you're looking into the future, that there's a gap between, and a growing gap between employment and labor force numbers. And so he was, again, making the case about what does our state need to do in order to address that gap. And his takeaway points from his presentation were that, again, that Minnesota's population, as it is right now, is going to grow fairly slowly. We're going to become more older and diverse, and everybody knows these things. So if our future population growth is likely going to depend on immigration. And our immigration populations grow more diverse, but we're still lagging the U.S. in immigration. And basically without immigration, to Minnesota, the labor force is going to grow more slowly, and that means potentially, I mean, he was using phrases like possibly the economy could stall out a little bit and stuff, so we just, it's really something that we have to pay attention to. So he recommended that local government be thinking more about integration of immigrants in terms of social, economic, and political integration, and expansion rather than contraction of the flow of immigrants to the United States. And I thought particularly, he said repeatedly that we should be more welcoming to immigrants, and I thought about Professor Saeed's thing about bicultural integrated kind of approach, that if we don't take that could be considered more welcoming, that we're not kind of forcing people to assimilate right away. So I think that was kind of his main message, that this is not only important as a good policy, but it's like kind of critical for our economy. It was the punchline with his message. So with that, I am going to start it off with a question to the panelists. And again, you can see again, very varied perspectives on this whole thing, but that's what we thought it'd be fun to bring it all together. So as you probably know, and Kelly, you know for sure, Hennepin County is the largest and arguably most complex local unit of government in the state. It's got urban, suburban, exurban, and rural areas and many different cultural groups. And it affects the county programs and operations in a lot of different ways, because there's human services with food assistance, housing assistance, child protection, youth services, there's law enforcement in the courts. We have a big corrections program with probation services and actual facilities. And then there's a whole public works department with roads and transit and environmental issues. So my very easy first question is, what do you think the county should be most focused on with regard to immigration issues? Really not a very easy question at all, but so who would like to, given the complexity of the county, what should they be most focused on with regard to the immigration issues? Really not an easy question at all. Who wants to grab that one?
I think, to be quite frank, I think part of the issue really has to be having to decide a little bit of what Saeed was describing, is what are the values that we want and intrinsic to the county and the policy. So just as an example, one, obviously I think Professor Allen's point about making sure that, I think the general notion is Hennepin needs to really make sure that they continue to be a place in which they want to attract people to come live here. In order to attract people to come live here, you don't want a population that is afraid. So I think keeping a mindset of making sure that we do whatever we can to make sure that issues about immigration are not completely based on fear, which is what just flat out, I'm not going to pretend. I think this current presidential administration is very much wielding fear as this overall weapon, right? Second, I think the thing that I think really needs to be considered is making sure that access to that kind of resources is not just because it's a valuable thing, it's a good, like it makes you feel good, but I think it's the most effective way to deal with issues. Like, as an example, let's talk about any sort of food assistance, health assistance, or whatnot. Doing it in a piecemeal way that's only accessible to certain groups in the community will hurt everybody, right? It's not just the people that don't get access to it that will be hurt. So I think those are the things to really think about. I personally, would continue to push on. I think right now, unfortunately, immigration reform is tied in with criminal justice reform. So if we really want to be serious about both of those things, criminal justice reform and immigration reform, I think we really need to consider that whole apparatus. What it means for policing, what it means for imprisonment, what we mean for pretrial detention, what it means for contracts, jail use. All of those things are all tied in, because I think right now that is being used as a primary way, as a detection mode for immigration. So helping reform, or at least think about what we want in a criminal justice system, can really help talk about what is necessary and figure out how that interact with the immigration.
I would agree with what Professor Chan is saying. I do think that the county is so multifaceted and dynamic, and it's as dynamic as its employees. I think that the county does a great job reaching out to the residents that we serve. I do think, though, that we could get better at educating ourselves as well as educating the people we serve and speaking and walking the talk that Hennepin County is. We are people who want to reach out and serve and empower our residents. But we also need to be sensitive to the issues that they're dealing with daily. And I think right now, one of the challenges that my office is feeling, and it spills into district court and the other stakeholders or professional partners in the criminal justice system, is that the government is this amorphous big government. So if government is someone who's going to detain me and arrest me, it's very hard for me to better understand that that government is a friend or a support or a resource. And so I do think that as employees, people who are on the line engaging with residents, it would be important for us to be mindful and intentional about our language and our actions and engaging with the residents who are here that are immigrants, because it's super difficult to know whether you're a friend or a foe, and I'm more inclined not to engage in the service. And if I don't engage, or if I don't call when I see a crime, or if I don't reach out to inform my commissioner what's happening in my neighborhood, we aren't a strong society. And so I think that education and communication are areas where we can be. Of course, I'm tied to the criminal justice system, and that's my bread and butter. But I do think overall for the county, we could do better in how we engage with our residents. We're doing well, but we can get better because the environment is one that is extremely hostile to non-citizens.
So those two responses are actually a really good setup for what I wanted to say, which, Linus mentioned fear and the role of fear, and I think that's a really important concept to think about, but also where that fear comes from. And fear often comes from ignorance. And when I use the word ignorance not in the disparaging sense of the term, but just in the lack of knowing, lack of information. Right? And ignorance often comes from lack of exposure. Right? So we can't underestimate the impact of long-term policies within this county and others around the entire country around housing policies and transportation policies that have kept us apart from one another. Right? So we're talking about segregation, institutional segregation. So keeping people from different backgrounds not living in the same communities or not having the same daily sort of exposure to one another. Right? So there's a lot of research in social psychology on what's called the contact hypothesis. And the contact hypothesis is a very simple idea that's been refined over 50, 60 years, but that actually having meaningful, sustained, positive interactions with people who are different from you leads you to see those people in a more positive light. Really big surprise, right? You're talking about psychology being common sense. That's one that's kind of common sense. So we think about ways in which, there's at the policy level, we can think about how do we undo some of the damages that we've done in terms of our urban planning. But then just at the, how do we determine who's friend and foe, right? And that's related to what do we know about people who are different from us? How much time do we actually take to think about who is this person? What are their life circumstances? How might some of their circumstances actually be sort of similar to some of my circumstances, but just look different at first, right? So in my presentation that I gave a month ago, I talked about you can think of migration at so many different scales, right? So I gave my example of I'm a migrant from California. I grew up in California. I lived there until 10 years ago when I came to Minnesota. There are cultural differences between Minnesota and California that I continue to navigate, right? Some of those are very apparent and some of them not so. There are sort of migratory challenges between living in the suburbs and the urban center of the city, right? And then there are migratory challenges from coming from other countries to the US or anywhere else. And some of those are very different contexts, of course, but there are also similarities in terms of the underlying psychological processes and the importance of having to navigate difference. So I think trying to find those commonalities and using those to connect with people who are different from you can really address some of the issues that both of them face.
Thank you. Now I know a lot of you had questions at the various brown bags, so we thought we'd just open it up right now to just, and not only questions but also comments, things that you want to have the panel react to. Go ahead.
I just had a question for Professor Chad. I thought it was really interesting, the idea of criminal reform and immigration reform, and how you suggested that we needed to basically address that as a whole, rather so that, because it becomes one and the same in some ways. But is there a way to separate it? Because just because you're an immigrant doesn't mean that you have actually a criminal past or has that. And I feel like when we look at it that way, it's like to almost suggest that they're one and the same, and they are two separate issues. So is it because it's difficult in this environment, this presidency, where they are, if you're an immigrant, therefore we have to talk about criminal reform, when that's really not even, it's a non sequitur for me.
So there's two ways to think about it. One question is a normative way, right, which is what should be this, and one is just a descriptive analysis. The descriptive of what has been written about and talked about is called crimmigration, which is the overt transformation of the immigration system, which has been called since the turn of the century a civil system, into a criminal system, and that has happened. What I think most people don't realize is that it really has only happened in the last 20 years. Like if you go back 25 years, the systems really were much more separate. You did not have detention facilities that were acting both as county jails and immigration prisons. They just were not as ubiquitous as they are. Right? Where you now have something along the lines of 400,000 people in any given year are detained in immigration detention at any point in any single day, at least 40. Right now, I think the last number was anywhere between 45 and 48,000 people every day. Right? While if you go back prior to 2005, those numbers were something along the lines of 10,000. And if you go all the way back into the 1980s, you're talking about hundreds. You're no longer even talking about the tens of thousands range. So, yes, if I were emperor of the world, I would definitely think that it's a very bad idea to have them intertwined. But that's the reality. That's what I'm more addressing. Is that right now the reality is that one of the primary methods, and we're talking about interactions with the government, right? One of the reasons why we can't separate criminal and immigration as much is because everything that's used to detect crime is now also being used as a tool for immigration enforcement. Right? Every single interaction that you have in the context that can lead to what the criminal justice system is looking for has now been co-opted, whether with or without permission. There are certain jurisdictions, of course, that view immigration as a criminal justice matter and therefore are will happily oblige in joining in on those sort of immigration efforts. But even the criminal justice jurisdictions that are not complicit, or in fact even want to resist the notion of being co-opted into the criminal justice system. There's a paper that I wrote with a few people called Describing Sanctuary Cities, what it is. There's quite a bit about the limitations of what sanctuary cities are. Hennepin County, no matter what the board does, no matter what the sheriff does, it will be used as part of immigration enforcement. Partially because of the way information sharing is occurring right now, and part of the way because of the way that the laws that Congress wrote right now. So those things are almost, it's a reality. Do I think it could, does it need to be that way? No. But I don't see a change in that anytime soon, mainly because I think the culture or the understanding of immigration and criminality has become very much enmeshed. You know, this administration, that's exactly the angle that they use to talk about it. Do I think that's true? No, of course not. Do I think it's something that we should get out of? Yes. But the reality is, on a practical day-by-day operation, the criminal justice system and I'm not just talking about state and local, but the federal, right? The number one crime being prosecuted in every federal courts, the number one crime, more than drugs, is migration crimes. Illegal entry is the number one prosecuted crime in district court. It is the second lowest, second highest in prison, federal prison population. The reason why it's not the higher is because most of them get prosecuted, convicted, and then they don't have much of a time to serve. Misdemeanors are usually less than 6 months. But the point here is that's already happened. This enmeshment between the criminal justice system and immigration enforcement system, that's happening. And so in order to get to a situation is we need to be really cognizant of that when we think about both criminal justice reform and immigration reform. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying it's what we want or whether or not it's possible to disentangle them, but disentangling is really, really hard, right? Even other jurisdictions outside of Hennepin County have tried to do sanctuary city ordinances or tried to do a lot of it. It's really hard to get something with bite and teeth that's not going to be politically difficult. So I think it's always, and you see, all of those kind of what we call disentanglement provisions almost always reserve a clause for what they think are the most dangerous criminals, right? Even though that's not really this is a weird little add-on to everything. And so I think it's very, if you ask me, I think almost the ship has sailed. Like, this is entangled. If we do want to get to a point to unentangle them, that is what I would think would be something that would be very useful. But we're really not quite there yet as a national moment. So. I hope that answers it.
Can I add something? I've been working on an immigration project for over a year with eligibility supports and the Hennepin County Office of Multicultural Services. What makes everything so complicated is that there are close to 1,000 different immigration codes for people that are here in the United States. And those are the people, they may come and have temporary permission, they may be here on student visas. A lot of them are allowed for 2 years. Some people are allowed here for 2 years and they have to go back to their country and petition again to come back, and then they eventually can petition to become legal LPRs, the legal permanent residents, which people, they're like the quote green card holders. But the statuses of people change on a regular basis depending on when we're in wars, when we're in conflicts. Every year there's a change of status about who can come as refugees based on everything going on in the world. And that's what makes it exceptionally difficult, because we have so many different statuses. If there was a way that some of this could be streamlined, it would be easier. But then the immigration department, they are so far backed up. People might lose their green card, and then they're in trouble if they've lost their green card, and they may actually be here legally, and they may need to renew it. And the Immigration Services, USCIS, they openly say that they're like sometimes 9 months behind in processing all this, and then they see a lot of people in trouble because of that. They may have applied to continue their residency or change their status and done everything, but they don't have all the paperwork, and so then they kind of get entangled in having a lot of legal issues also, and that's kind of clogging up our system. And that, I mean, there are a lot of people here, immigrants who are here legally and may never encounter the criminal justice system. And then, of course, we have the whole other issue of the undocumented, that, they're coming here just to try and work and support their families. So.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize that the reason why you have so many different kinds of statuses,
yeah,
so many different categories,
right,
is that immigration is a classic example of something constantly being built on top of each other and trying to please everybody and nobody, right? I mean, it's a classic bureaucratic aspect of the law, that in my, one of the reasons why I got into immigration law is that I think it's constantly changing, it's exciting, but it's also very, very frustrating on a practical sense, is that it's constantly changing. And especially when you see that it's so subject to political winds, right? It's so subject, it is the number one scapegoat, as well as the number one way of thinking about it. It just is always in that context. And so it's not a surprise that it gets confusing, and because, and this is just one really quick point, processing has never gotten any quote-unquote budget love from Congress, right? You know why? They actually make processing pay for themselves. So CIS is not actually getting anything from our taxes. They pay for CIS. Most of CIS's budget, when it comes to processing, comes from fees. So that's why you have some fees on some applications can be extraordinarily high. One of the things that has changed has been the difficulty in getting something like a fee waiver.
Yeah.
Getting an application in and getting a fee waiver used to be relatively straightforward. Now, even people with quote-unquote means-tested benefits are not always going to be automatically going to get the fee waiver. And I think now, when more people are going to be afraid to take advantage of certain state and government programs, then it's going to be even harder to prove that they need a fee. So it wouldn't be a surprise to me that a lot of people are in sort of processing limbo.
Right.
So that is absolutely what's going on. We are putting a lot of money on enforcement. That is the largest federal agency. The DHS, ICE, and CBP are the biggest federal law enforcement. Way bigger than the FBI. Probably 3 to 4 times bigger than the FBI. Those are the agencies we spend money on.
It's the second largest police force in the world.
Yeah, exactly. And where we are not putting money in is processing, both on immigration judges and cases, which is why you have a backlog of over 700,000 court cases, and in processing of applications. Naturalization applications are now on this huge backlog where a lot of them are in limbo for 2 to 3 years.
Right.
So those are definitely issues that are happening.
And I can appreciate I can hear the angst and kind of the frustration in that, because it's so hard to predict and understand the different statuses. Now imagine you are someone who's riding the train, and for some reason you forgot you didn't have your card, or fees to pay for that train ride, and you get a ticket, and you've been riding the train and you failed to pay. And you end up coming in, let's just say, and maybe they charged you for something else. You end up coming into criminal court. And you might think, I just want to pay this ticket. I had a card, but I didn't have it on me, so I'm going to admit I didn't have the fee. I didn't pay the fee the time I rode the train. We now are finding with this growing case law and what can be used to impact people's statuses, that if someone was to come in, maybe not even have a lawyer, just pay the ticket, that petty misdemeanor admission, not a crime, saying that I didn't pay to ride the train, could be used against them.
Right.
And could impact their status. And if we, the professionals, have a difficult time understanding the status and how it's going to be impacted, think about Joe Public, Jane Public, resident of Hennepin County. It's super challenging. That's not to say that we can't do it, but it is a heavy burden. And to do it alone in isolation, I think, is not where we're strong. We do have to partner, not only within the county, but also outside of the county with community partners. But I appreciate the frustration. We hear that often, and we appreciate the dynamicness of immigration, and I'm glad that there are practitioners who are inclined to go there and really try to figure it out, but it seems to change so quickly.
Oh, yeah.
So this maybe is as much a personal question as it is a county employee question, but it becomes really difficult then when so I work in the law library in the courts tower, and we try to offer services to everyone. We invite people in, and when the new administration came in, among the public libraries, there's this big concern about getting immigration information out to people. Well, because it changes so much, I was always reluctant to actually put anything in print and send it out for fear that some executive order was going to undo that information. And I will not invite people into this building because it seems dangerous to me. And maybe I'm overly afraid of that, but it just seems sort of irresponsible. So as an employee, then you feel a little like your hands are tied. What is a way to be welcoming and accepting when, every time you talk to someone, you're like, what is your immigration status and what kind of proof do you have before I'm willing to invite you into my place? You know what I mean? So it's very frustrating. We try to go out. Of course, that's what we should all be doing in government more, maybe. But I just wanted to kind of articulate that some of us kind of take on the fear that we see in these communities, and it would be helpful if, as a county, we could figure out a way to move beyond that.
I appreciate what you're saying. I do think that the county does want these buildings, our facilities, our services to be accessible. What's challenging also, though, is that we have public facilities. And so there have been situations where ICE, it has been lingering. And it has changed our practice. It has changed our practice because there are times where just by matter of every day having multiple appearances, I might say, Mr. Johnson, because I don't see Mr. Johnson. There's a number of people in the room. I don't do that anymore. Because if Mr. Johnson is not a citizen or has yet to naturalize and he raises his hand, I'm not sure who else is there. Now, ICE has done its best to try to honor the due process and will wait until after we're done finishing our appearance to arrest our clients. I don't think that's honoring, but still, it is happening. And so when our clients, and doing law, at the law library, you want to be as accurate as possible. I appreciate that. As a lawyer, when my client says, if I come to court, could I get arrested? I have to be stone cold sober and straight about that. I can afford my client strategies. Meet me on this floor. Don't meet me in front of the courtroom. Come with a buddy. But then also not to assume that that buddy is well prepared if something was to happen. What is their role in that? It's extremely challenging. And you don't want to project that fear. But I do think we have to acknowledge it and be sensitive as employees and try to be that warm face and hand of the county saying, we appreciate where you're at. Here are some strategies. Here are some resources.
So my response might not be popular. I'll say that out there. I think one of the things that I've noticed in the last couple, I've been doing this for a little less than 2 decades, but I think one of the things that I've noticed is as interior immigration enforcement has become more prominent and bigger and has been part of the national conversation more and more, I think we have unfortunately started to put the idea of immigration status as a source of identity. We now think very much, we have become hyper aware of and think very much in context of citizen, non-citizen, right? So, for instance, say he was talking about he's a former resident of California, so am I, right? There are points in time, obviously, that we could think of it as identity, but it would be odd if I were to go to a government office and they're asking me, were you born in North Carolina or were you born in California? Now, that said, I know a lot of benefits are prefaced on immigration status, such as citizenship status. Some of it has some reasoning to it. Some of it, I think, is at least reflexive, and not necessarily the idea, right? I mean, there's this huge fight over driver's licenses right now, right? And I come from a state of Illinois. When I was living in Illinois, that was the fight in Illinois. What happened in Illinois was there was a trucker scam. And what happened on that trucker scam was a bunch of people got killed with a commercial driver who wasn't properly licensed, right? And And so the idea very much in Illinois, when that debate came up, it was an issue of public safety. People are going to drive. We better have an actual system that recognizes that the driver's license is a driver's license. And I think one thing that we're starting to come across is we have used things like driver's licenses as IDs when we don't have a national ID. I think there's a separate issue about whether or not you want to argue that there should or shouldn't be a national ID, but at the very least, a lot of people for a long time in the history of America have rejected the idea of a national ID. So my reaction is, I do think, I understand, I think it's absolutely important to understand and make sure we give information accurately. That's another thing that I will say, is as a lawyer, one of our primary reflexes is when something changes in the law, we write a whole bunch of flyers and try to publish it and go, whew! Like we call them pro se materials, right? And because immigration doesn't have a public defender system where people are not, that's the only way we think we can give immigration advice without representing everybody, right? Is to give them something to read that tells them that information. And I know very much so that is completely and highly inadequate. And I think even, giving full access to the law, highly, highly dubious in terms of ability to use that information on the practical, on the ground level that's accurate. So these are really big challenges. And really, the only way I think currently the reaction has to be more representation. And I think at least I'm hoping, from my personal point of view, is that we stop using identity, like this whole idea of biculturalism. Really, if there wasn't this sense of, are you a citizen or not a citizen, would it be necessary to make our allegiance known as if citizenship was a repository for our rights? That's never been the case. The Bill of Rights talks about people. It did not used to care about whether or not they're citizens. Increasingly, I think there is more and more language that seems to indicate that might be the case. But at least for now, that's something that I personally would like to see. And that's just a personal comment.
Professor Allen did say that Minnesota just generally needs to be more welcoming. I'm wondering, this is a question for everyone on the panel, what is like one or two things that we could do as, personal, in our personal life, but also maybe in our work lives to make Minnesota more welcoming?
Everyone's looking at me for some reason. Some of you might recall a couple of years ago, NPR did a extended segment about the unwelcomingness of Minnesota. So beyond just the issues of immigration, just in general. So people like myself who come from other states, how Minnesotans, those who have been here for a long time, tend to be a little less open to those who haven't. Because there are many, I've noticed, Minnesotans are quite proud of their Minnesotanness. And they should be for a lot of reasons, I think. But it was interesting that NPR felt like there is sufficient evidence for this idea that there's something about this place where people who are longtime residents have a sort of more insular view. And it's very difficult for newcomers to crack through that. Honestly, I don't fully understand where that comes from or why that is. Maybe some of you have some insights into that. But the one thing I learned when I first moved, I'm going anecdotal, but one thing I learned when I moved here is when you say something about yourself, when someone from Minnesota says, "Oh, that's interesting," but that's not a good thing, right? Interesting is code for that's sort of foreign and strange. I don't quite understand that, but okay, right? So thinking about instead of I think there tends to be, again, this is just more anecdotal and sort of things I've heard from people. I don't know research on this kind of topic. But there tends to be less interest in sort of engaging with what's different and new and more just saying, oh, that's different. Okay, now I'm going to go on doing about what I already know, what I'm comfortable with. So sort of a steering toward what's comfortable versus challenging oneself to engage in what's different. Now that's just totally broad swath, and obviously there's a lot of exceptions to individual people. But again, the fact that our state radio station felt a need to do an extended segment on this issue of lack of welcomingness, and others notice this, that you don't notice in other places, suggests there is something in terms of our interpersonal interactions here in our way of being and our personality in Minnesota that just isn't as welcoming as it should be. So I'll just stop talking, others might want to.
I think I'm the native Minnesotan here. My people have been in Minneapolis specifically for over 100 years. We immigrated from, depending upon the day, what side of the meandering of the Rio Grande, you were either Mexican or you were Texan. But they came here, my great came here, grandfather came here to work on the railroad. And so when we talk about this culture of Minnesota, it's always funny to me because when we describe it, it doesn't sound at all like my family, right? Really, when we think Minnesotan, we think maybe stoic, reserved, caring, compassionate people, but just going to stick to themselves. And usually not too judgmental, but rather just, we start the small talk. That weather out there is cold. Did you see the snow? How was the fog for you? How was traffic? It was slick. We talk about weather. What I would encourage us to do is kind of the same thing that my parents told me to do. And maybe it's because my parents came from this bicultural, I'm a kid of the 70s, right? And they were all about, you were a new creation, you are bicultural, and you are cosmopolitan. That means that you go and you meet people, and they're always like you because you're people, right? And so try to engage with people. Get out of your comfort zone, like you said. Have that contact. But I think also, Minnesotans are pretty good listeners. If we really think about it, we're just usually not very expressive, but we're listening. It'd be nice to even give some affirmative give and take with people who aren't like us. It might be in the grocery store. It becomes more welcoming. You share a little bit about yourself, which I think sometimes is culturally inconsistent, right? We're trained to be reserved and smile and be nice, generally. So if I was to have some takeaways, the things that I tell my children, be approachable, be friendly. Friendly meaning extend yourself. Don't just stand there, extend yourself. And I think that, I'm proud to be a county employee. I think that we try to do that in our own different ways. What's wonderful is that we're all different arrows in the quiver. We're not all the same. But I think that would be maybe some self-reflection as to what the culture of Minnesota is, and maybe even to expand our perspective that it's not just one way.
In the back?
Yeah, I was kind of going off of that conversation, interested in what any of you would say about intersections and identity, that there's, we're talking about status is not identity, but certainly being newer to Minnesota or the U.S. is an identity. And in terms of the Minnesota nice and who a Minnesotan is, there's this othering, right? And we are a terrible state in terms of inequity. And that usually maps to us talking about black versus white racial inequity, which is huge, but also thinking about LGBT inequity and poverty and all those issues that can map together with immigration to create even more. So is there anything you can say about what you're seeing or thinking about who people are in all their identities and how that intersects with immigration and government? I know that's kind of...
No, I mean, I think it's interesting you say that. There's a few of my clients, it automatically, I represent people in many ways, so a lot of these discussions, things that will stand out to me are people that I've represented. For instance, I've represented a Somali trans woman, I've represented a closeted Mexican man who's, I've represented a lot of people who are in many ways many different intersections of some of the identities that you're talking about that are difficulty. I think one of the things that is really, I don't really have advice, or all I can say is that in my personal and professional work, you need to just be very, very cautious about making sure you're not making too many assumptions about where they're coming from or what they are. And it really, Charlotte talked about being really making sure you listen, and I think listening is really hard to do these days. That's important, but I also think, it's odd, right? I think one thing that you're not, like personal blind spot is where I live in South Minneapolis. I like to think that it's a relatively diverse neighborhood, but I also don't ever spend any time in Northeast. I don't spend any time in North Minneapolis. I occasionally will drive people out to different areas in St. Paul, but I almost never spend time there. And I think that really restricts my understanding. It absolutely does. And so what does that mean? It means either I'm involved in certain volunteer organizations and opportunities, but it's always really difficult and it's not practical. I have a family, I have a 2-year-old. These are all really hard things, and the only thing I can say is, like, at a certain level, the best that I can do at certain points is just be aware of my own ignorance. Just be aware that, like, I do not know what it's like to have an entire family go through a civil war less than 20 years ago. I do not know what it's like when when my parents had a whole set of siblings that died during the killing fields. Like, these are things that I just do not have access, and I don't think I can. I think the best thing for me to do is not pretend that I can figure that out. So in that respect, I think just on a professional level, I think on a governmental-wide level, right? There's all these things are all interconnected, which makes it so hard. Things like housing, how that affects everything, employment opportunities, work, all of these things, education, everything is tied in to all of this. So, pick something. I mean, I think that's one thing, right? Is almost like instead of letting it overwhelm us, I think the idea is just pick something. You will probably have an effect. So, you won't get hurt by it. Those are just...
So building on some of those ideas, there's a pet peeve that I have about how people characterize Minnesota, shared with my colleague Rich Lee in my department, is that often people will refer to Minnesota in general, or Twin Cities in particular, as not diverse or only white. That's not at all true, right? And it's really a peeve because it's not adequately attending to and acknowledging the vast diversity that we actually do have here. And if you don't acknowledge it, then you don't really have to deal with it, right? One of the reasons why, I'm glad that you highlighted how we have the largest achievement gap between white and black students in the country, and that often gets swept aside because we don't talk about the diversity that's here, right? So first we have to acknowledge, yes, this is a place where there is diversity. And it's not just in the cities. You talk about different sort of identities and social locations where urban-rural is a really big one here. I know it doesn't interface quite as much with Hennepin County in particular, but it's a little, county's pretty big. I'm a Ramsey County person, so I don't know anything about it. See identities. But if you look at rural ethnic minority populations, they're the ones struggling the most, especially the youth. If you look at mental health concerns and suicide attempts or ideation or completions, it's much higher for ethnic minorities in the rural parts of Minnesota than in the center or in the cities. And so we have to consider that too, that there is diversity outside of the cities. There is diversity in the suburbs. And just attending to that and paying attention to it. As I mentioned before, some of my work is in immigration in Western Europe. I focus mostly in Sweden, but also a little bit in Germany, and so I've learned more about sort of what's going on in Europe. And there's really a debate in a lot of Western European countries about whether or not those countries are diverse societies. Are we ethnically diverse? And the majority view tends to be, no, we are not. We are ethnically homogenous countries. And many argue that that's never been true in any of those countries, right? That's never been the case. It's always been sort of a political, power-based mechanism sort of just to maintain power for those who have it. And I see a lot of that in the way people talk about Minnesota too, and not acknowledging the diversity around in all its forms and in all its intersections. So building on what Lina said, it's really being aware and understanding what's around you and what you don't understand about it is really the first step. But if you don't think that we live in a diverse society right here, then it's going to be tough to do anything downstream.
I guess it's kind of shifting gears a little bit, but I'm a child protection social worker, and so some of the struggles that we've been having is we keep trying to find like patterns and like ways to kind of detect like, oh, if it says a maltreatment finding, then that shouldn't get in the way of their immigration. And we're finding that somehow ICE is still finding out about our cases being open at least, and then like I just recently had somebody stopped at the Miami International Airport, and he was detained, and our case is closed. He never was like criminally charged, but there's like a maltreatment finding, I guess, and so it's just different things that we're just trying to continuously figure out how to prevent those issues. Because whenever we come into the picture, our goal is not to have anything to do with immigration. But now we're having to, we kind of do different things. Like some of the legal writers are changing the wording of some of the petitions to not say, the parents brought their 12-year-old here, in whatever year, which would directly say that they illegally brought the child to the U.S. And so instead of putting that in the court document, which would be public for people to see, we're trying to make those changes. But I feel like if we weren't aware, like it's not a policy to do that. And so we're just kind of making those decisions on a case-by-case basis. So I guess, we'll continue to do that, but I'm just kind of wondering how we can get on top of this. And the other thing is, I thought that we were a sanctuary city, but like, what does that even mean? Because at this point, I've had a mother turn herself in, and then like 2 days after she got out of Hennepin County Jail, after her arraignment, she was deported to Mexico. She's never come back, and she didn't go to her. She was being criminally charged, but she didn't get to go and do anything besides be deported. And so, like, how is Hennepin County Jail, like, is there any talk about them, like, not communicating with ICE, or, like, how do we figure out what we're supposed to do, at least from our county? We can influence maybe what we do. I don't know.
So
it's frustrating.
Yeah. If you would talk of it, I have a few thoughts, but you
Start and I'll.
Okay. One, it doesn't surprise to me that everything you put in a database will start to get into ICE.
Yeah.
The amount of information sharing has exploded in the last few years, especially the tracking. And I think I like to tell this to people, like, the amount of tracking of non-citizens has gotten to the point where it really is the stuff of sci-fi. But really, the important thing to understand is you cannot track non-citizens if you don't track citizens. It's a meaningless thing. They're not doing this only by, what's in the absence. They have to track citizens in order to track non-citizens. So if you think this increased information sharing doesn't impact those of us with U.S. birth certificate, absolutely does. So it doesn't surprise me at all. The second reaction on the sanctuary cities will say, there's a lot of things that are entangled with this. Sanctuary cities, in many respects, in the way that it's talked about in Minneapolis, is really, in Hennepin, is this notion of disentanglement. meaning that county resources are not being used in law enforcement, in immigration enforcement. But as I said, because those systems are naturally merging anyway, it's no longer a choice. The information is being shared. Now, one of the things that I've heard varying reports and denials and whatever, but my understanding is definitely people who work at Hennepin County Jail are communicating with ICE. There is a federal statute that purports to forbid any state or local jurisdiction from preventing said communication with ICE. Now that statute, ironically, was defended by then Mayor Giuliani, was attacked by Mayor Giuliani. He didn't like that statute when he was mayor of New York. Now, of course, I'm sure you guys all know he's probably all for it. But there is a question about whether that federal forbidding of that sort of restriction would be lawful or constitutional. But at least at this point in time, at least the law is there. So what can a local jurisdiction do? If the law says you cannot forbid state employees from sharing that information, there have been some strategies, such as stop asking, right? Don't ask, don't tell. But as I said, almost every single booking form includes place of birth, and potentially a lot of them also include citizenship status, because it has become a sense of our self-sorting mechanism. So I will say, absolutely, the amount of information that we're putting in any database is starting to get to a point where it'll be very interesting to see how that will go forward, and then being used more and more on the immigration enforcement side. And then, sanctuary cities, there's a lot of questions of what that might mean, what that's going to look like. It is a debate that's being shaped in the next few years.
Those same strategies that you are using in child protection are also being utilized, of course, in criminal court, as you can imagine. But as Professor Chan indicated, just the amount of information that's accessible publicly, it makes it extremely difficult. So even when you're doing your best to carve out this exception, to make sure that the true focus of your service to that individual is not entangled with immigration necessarily, but to the true issue that you were trying to address, it is used because it's public and it's impacting people. You talked about a lady who turned herself in, taking responsibility, turns herself in at the jail, and then is likely released without the requirement of bail, but now that she's free, ICE can pick her up. It is happening a lot. As Professor Chan indicated, there are individuals who are arrested or booked at the jail. They have yet to be appointed services of a public defender if they were eligible, and they are being released. They're thinking they're riding the elevator to go right on up and go home, but they don't make it to the ground floor. They're arrested, and then they're in ICE detention. They didn't have access to any phone calls to let their family know. They don't know what to do, and they're in ICE detention. Many of those individuals call our office. Not because we're their lawyers yet, but we're the office to call. Because they have been told that's where you go, and if you have a Hennepin County issue or you think you might, call them. And so we've been trying to help those individuals. But it's extremely challenging, because then we ask for a court order to bring them to court so that we can continue to work on the case, and our writs aren't being honored. And people aren't being able to show up and access due process. It's happening a lot. And so I would just applaud your efforts, continue doing so, and we have to be as informed as we can to ensure that what we're doing to tailor that response, that it's specific to the issue we're addressing and can't be used later, which is very hard to predict sometimes.
I'm also in child protection. So is it accurate that the child protection court records are not as private as I was hoping? I mean, are they, I was thinking and told that they're more protected, but are they not from ICE at this point? Like, can they access them?
I don't know of any specific means that ICE has access to those records. I don't. I'm just not surprised that any of that information gets to ICE.
And is there any way to protect someone? I mean, is it does ICE, they can just kind of do what they want and access what they want, or is there any?
One of the more difficult things has been, right, is because ICE is a law enforcement agency, a lot of the protections we have about certain documents tend to not extend to law enforcement agencies. Now, it's really weird because these are still civil enforcement, right? But that's my understanding. I am not an authority. I do not know what the Child Protection Court's actual provisions are. But my suspicion, and I understand that a lot of these protections for sealing records and whatnot are usually making exception to law enforcement. And because ICE is a law enforcement agency, that exception may prove to be what's allowing people access. Though I don't know. I really don't want to. Now I'll probably get quoted.
And I have some more questions and comments. So, kind of a comment, I worry a lot about the children in so many different ways. In a previous position that I held, families were not willing to take the risk in their mind to apply for benefits that they should have. Health insurance, WIC, food support for their families, and now their children are suffering. They might show up on child protection because it looks like they're neglecting their children, not bringing them in for care, don't have enough food. And I've tried to educate them, but there's no guarantee, I can never guarantee anything. There's so much fear, and now it's going to be even worse if there's changes with the public charges. But it's, I really worry about that. And the, parents being picked up at different times coming out of the jail or traffic stop or whatever it is, and children being left with one parent, not having income, what that means for our community. Let's just kind of make a comment. But I have a question too, kind of related to that situation. For legal permanent residents, are they just at as much risk of being picked up without a a criminal history or anything on the record?
Without a criminal history, it's very difficult for. Usually, the primary method of a lawful permanent resident losing status is through a crime and requiring a conviction.
Right.
Does not a charge won't usually do it for a lawful permanent resident. That said, there is some question. One of the problems is some people have very, very old convictions. I had someone who was a 30-year-old conviction. And then they had never been picked up, never told that anything was wrong with it. They've been out, lived their life. Great. They naturalized. As soon as they went in for their naturalization hearing, they got picked up and are in immigration. Right? And may not have a way to fight. Then there are some of these cases where you're hearing there's that whole fraud unit that's being put forth that's on the denaturalization side. They're basically examining whether people who naturalized, but looking at whether or not there was ever any fraud in the processing. And I can tell you, this does have a Minnesota component in the idea of so many refugee populations, right? I'm sure you work with quite a few refugees where relationships are not always exactly clear, birth dates are not always clear. Right now, this fraud unit is supposedly not going to look for minor discrepancies or inconsistencies, but there is a fear, right, that might be extended to certain people who are in that population. So the point is, citizenship won't necessarily save you, right? This is an issue that can go beyond that point. But there are very relatively, if you're a lawful permanent resident, there are extremely few different ways, very few ways in which you can lose your green card without having a criminal conviction. It's not impossible, but it's pretty rare.
Yeah, I think we're just going to take let's take one more. You haven't had a question, have you?
Yeah, I have not.
Go ahead.
I have a question for Dr. Syed about the psychology of immigration. So with how restrictive and punitive the environment is right now, and I don't know if you talked at all about this in your solo presentation, But are you seeing does that push a trend more toward the assimilation, separation, marginalization quadrants and away from the bicultural, or as resistance? Is there resistance that pops up?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think so far we don't really know. I don't think. The short answer is all of those different strategies, those different 4 quadrants, are inhabited by people for different reasons, right? And the one that is, as I said, the most optimal, that based on what we know psychologically, is bicultural. The one that's the most risky is the marginalized, right? Really feeling like you have no community that you're a part of. And so that, I think that's your question is current climate sort of pushing people more towards marginalization?
Yeah.
And especially when looking at issues of engaging in criminal behavior or radicalization and things of that nature are related to this marginalization kind of component. Really feeling like there's no place for me, right? So I don't think there's sufficient data at this point to be able to track an increase in that. You know, whether the changes in the climate and the atmosphere have been associated with increases in sense of marginalization. At this point, in terms of, because unfortunately psychological research is incredibly slow, because when I talk about identity, for example, I'm not talking about just US and Mexican. It's how Mexican do I feel? How American do I feel? It's subjective. There are things that we have to rate at the individual level, right? So we collect data at individuals, need to follow them over time to see how they change. So unfortunately, our data always lag behind the current moment. So I can't speak to that. But we know it's not wise to be engaging in societal behaviors that will promote marginalization. Let's say that. We know that that's true.
Yeah, some of the impact.
The downstream impact is not good, yes.
Quick one?
Yes, I just wanted to add to what she's saying. From my experience, I think it kind of pushes people away from trying to be, what's the word you use, people trying to come together.
Bicultural.
Yes, because there's a problem of trust. So personally, we tend to relate more with people from our own culture.
Yeah, there's research more broadly. It's on what's called a negative identity, which is really, it's beyond just the context of immigration. When society sort of devalues who you are and what contributions you can make to society, it's very difficult. Some people do, but it's more difficult to develop a sense of identity that is a positive one, that's in line with sort of general norms and expectations. And so you develop an identity that really is in opposition to those things. And again, that doesn't lead to positive outcomes.
I bet you some of you still have questions and would like to dialogue a little bit more. One of the things that we need to do when we're translating between Hennepin County and the University of Minnesota is Hennepin's very hierarchical and University of Minnesota is very flat organizationally. So these people operate fairly independently. So if you want to follow up with Professor Said or Professor Chan, I'm pretty sure that they are welcome. They would welcome that. And also, if you want to say, I want to go back and just look at that one presentation, we're trying to get them all up on our website right now. This is HC Connect SharePoint. And if you go to the HUP site, and you could just type in HUP and you could get to the site, under featured events, you'll be able to see their presentations. And we hopefully be able to see the video. We're still kind of working on it. I'm not sure if that's ready. Okay.
Are the archived presentations available to people outside Hennepin County University?
No, not right now. They're not. But if you email us, we can see about getting that to you.
Yeah, we're
So,
working on that
I'm
piece now.
fine with that.
Yeah, we would ask permission before we did that. So, yeah.
I consider everything I say public.
Okay. Well, I would. Well, if you join me in thanking our panelists.
Thanks for the great questions and
Yes.
engagement.
Very great questions. Thank you all very much.
Yeah, go back.